Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I think we can get started. Thank you for coming. First talk of the Applied Ethics series on artificial intelligence and experience this term. My name is Nir. I direct the Applied Ethics Center. And this afternoon, we are fortunate to have Professor Duncan Purves from the University of Florida. Duncan works on questions in applied ethics broadly, questions in the ethics of technology recently, more specifically, and has received a grant, a 3-year grant from NSF, specifically to study the fairness and other normative aspects of predictive policing. So without further ado, Duncan, thank you so much for being with us, and take it away.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks to Nir for inviting me, and thanks to the Applied Ethics Center for sponsoring. So when Nir invited me, he asked me to if I could give a talk on the intersection of artificial intelligence and phenomenology, or sort of the lived experience of AI, or how. And I said, well, not really.
And I said, that's fine too.
And he said, okay, well, come anyways. So that's what I did. But insofar as this talk sort of has a phenomenological component, you can think of it as being the way that people's lived experience with law enforcement and criminal justice can impact the normative status of policing technology. Okay, so that's sort of the intersection. If we're trying to tie the theme in, right? Okay. So in 2011, the Los Angeles Police Department began an experiment in crime fighting. They started testing Predpol, a predictive policing program, as a method for identifying the location and timing of criminal activity. So Predpol is based on a machine learning algorithm. It's trained on data about the type, location, and time of crime. And in principle, it's supposed to forecast future crime at highly specific locations and times. Here is an example of what you might see if you were an officer on patrol with a tablet running the Predpol program. These forecasts are displayed as heat maps of 500 by 500 square foot boxes, indicating high-risk areas in an officer's patrol. Data from recent crime reports can be incorporated each day to update the algorithm's forecast. And it's still in use today. Predpol is still in use today by the Los Angeles Police Department. And it's become the most widely used predictive policing software in the United States. Last I checked, there were over 60 police departments using Predpol or a comparable software. My home state, Florida, in Miami, they use a different predictive policing software. So Predpol's widespread adoption has been driven by a couple of attractive thoughts. The first thought is that a data-driven approach allows police to identify patterns in criminal activity that human analysts would be unable to identify. Because one advantage of machine learning is that it can do exactly that. It can identify patterns in data that humans just wouldn't see or couldn't see. And because it's data-driven, the thought is, it's supposed to be able to eliminate human bias in crime analysis. Okay. Biased hunches about where crime's going to occur. We'll say more about bias in a minute. And the second attractive thought is that merely by increasing police visibility in certain high crime areas, you can deter crime without increasing direct police contact with offenders. So the thought is, you send police where you know crime is very likely to occur, they hang out, drive around, and offenders who would have broken into a vehicle, right, broken into a convenience store, are deterred, right? They just don't commit the crime in the first place. That's the dream for this technology. So since its implementation in the LAPD initiative, predictive policing, as you may know, has been the subject of withering criticism in popular press, academic research, and by community organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP. So so this is a joint statement of civil rights concerns about predictive policing signed by a number of these groups. So the first concern is that predictive policing is ineffective. Okay. But it's ineffective in a very specific way. So when I say that it's ineffective, what I mean is it fails to produce the results that it is intended to. Okay. Or some close alternative measure would produce the results more effectively than this technology. So the reason that, that critics suggest that predictive policing is in fact ineffective is that it is driven by biased data. Okay. It's based on data that is in some way biased against minority communities, okay, because of biased policing practice. The second and related criticism is that because predictive policing is ineffective and biased against minority communities, it is unfair. It's in some way unfair to those communities to use predictive policing to allocate police resources. Okay. So my aim in this paper is to assess whether these common criticisms are sound. So I want to give a kind of a fair shake to these criticisms and to the proponents of the technology. So the format of the talk. So in section 2, I'm going to address the question about whether predictive policing is effective. I am going to argue briefly that predictive policing is effective in principle. And then I assess a common reason that's given for thinking that it is in fact ineffective, which is that predictive policing algorithms are trained on biased data. Right? And so they systematically misrepresent the proportion of criminal activity in predominantly black and Hispanic communities. I'll focus on black communities for the purposes of the talk, but I think a lot of what I say applies to predominantly Hispanic communities as well. In section 3, I tease apart questions about predictive policing's effectiveness from questions about its fairness. So I suggest that an effective policy of predictive policing might nonetheless impose an unequal burden of law enforcement on innocent members of some racial groups for the sake of promoting or achieving aggregate social benefit. Okay, so we burden some subgroup for the sake of benefiting the larger population, and that this policy would be, a policy like this would be effective but unfair. Okay. I then consider a response to the suggestion that such a policy would be unfair to certain racial minorities. According to this response, the disproportionate burdens that predictive policing places on members of those communities are not unfair because predictive policing generates disproportionate benefits for those communities in the form of crime reduction. Drawing on lessons from the ethics of third-party defense, I argue that this response, while initially somewhat plausible, ignores the moral authority that communities have over risky interventions that are aimed at benefiting them. Okay. And I'll say a bit more about that. But I conclude that fair predictive policing requires that police departments use non-enforcement-oriented crime-fighting strategies where feasible, and that they involve targeted communities in the strategic decision-making process whenever feasible. So those are my sort of practical upshots. All right, so that's the format for the talk. So, but first I want to talk about some preliminary points. So first, what is predictive policing? Well, I've said a little bit about it. There is no uniform definition of predictive policing in the criminological literature or computer science literature that I've found. So I'm not exactly sure how to say these authors' names. Mayer and Vessels, I suppose, I'm not sure. They define it as follows. They say predictive policing is the collection and analysis of data about previous crimes for identification and statistical prediction of individuals or geospatial areas with an increased probability of criminal activity to help developing policing intervention and prevention strategies and tactics. Okay, it's a mouthful. I think this is the definition that I'm going to work with for the talk. But notice that this definition includes both persons and places as potential targets of prediction by policing algorithms. Some predictive software, such as that used to generate Chicago's heat list, it's called a heat list, is used to identify individuals who are at high risk of being either a future offender or a future victim of a crime. Algorithms like Predpol, on the other hand, are used to make place-based predictions about where crime is likely to occur. In my paper, my focus is on place-based predictive policing. Nonetheless, I think everything I say here should apply similarly to person-based predictive policing. And I, of course, leave open the possibility that algorithms that are used to identify future offenders might raise their own distinct set of ethical concerns, right? But I think if you can show that there are some serious concerns about fairness related to place-based predictive policing, this should all apply just as well to person-based. Okay. Second preliminary point. Oh yeah, that's right, it's all in here. Is that I am going to set aside issues of police harassment and abuse in predominantly minority communities for the sake of focusing on moral problems with predictive policing itself. Now, I don't do that to seem out of touch. This is not to suggest that this issue is unimportant or that it does not bear substantially on the moral permissibility of predictive policing, right? If police systematically abuse members of the communities to which they're deployed, this constitutes a powerful independent reason not to use the technology. But my interest in this paper is to understand whether there's something morally problematic about using predictive policing to develop and use intervention strategies and tactics that they are otherwise permitted to use. Okay. So, for example, critics of predictive policing agree that police are permitted to conduct vehicle and foot patrols of neighborhoods where those patrols do not involve harassing or abusing members of those communities. What critics object to is the practice of deciding where to deploy those patrols on the basis of predictive policing forecasts. Or that's how I read these critiques. Now, of course, a predictive policing algorithm that deployed police officers in minority communities where officers then harassed and abused minority residents would be morally problematic, but this would be explainable by the fact that the strategies and tactics being used in those communities were themselves morally problematic, and not by the method of allocation itself. Okay, so I'm trying to, as is common in philosophy, to isolate the issue that we want to address. I also assume, though I'm not sure this assumption is warranted, that predictive policing is not merely an attempt by police departments to hide the fact that they're targeting racial minorities for additional scrutiny. That is, I will assume that police departments use programs like Predpol in good faith, okay, to target for additional scrutiny geographic areas with the greatest predicted risk of crime, and not to target any members of particular racial groups. If I did not assume that, if I assumed the reverse, if I assumed that they were doing that, this would be a talk on racial profiling. Right. And I think predictive policing is not, in principle, a form of racial profiling. So is predictive policing effective? So I assume in this talk that one legitimate aim of policing is the apprehension of individuals who violate the law and the deterrence of individuals from violating the law in the first place when those laws are worthy of being enforced. Okay. So there are laws we can imagine that exist that we don't think are worthy of being enforced. Okay. And so we shouldn't use predictive policing to help enforce those laws. Well, I want to set aside those laws. So, for example, drug laws might be a good example, right? But I take it that things like violent crime and property crime are the sorts of laws that we think police have legitimate reason to apprehend and deter people from committing. Right? So I think a simple observation strongly supports the claim that predictive policing is effective, at least in theory. Okay. Crime is without a doubt connected to place. Very small geographic areas within a city are responsible for a majority or significant plurality of all criminal activity. So for example, this is an image from that study. A study conducted by the Atlantic City Police Department in cooperation with criminologists at Rutgers found that 46% of robberies and 45% of shootings occurred in only 5% of Atlantic City's geographic area. Crime is concentrated not only within particular neighborhoods, but within specific blocks or groups of blocks within neighborhoods. So hotspots policing, which is a non-algorithmic predecessor of predictive policing that uses human crime analysts to identify risky places, has long acknowledged the connection between crime and place. So areas of focus of hotspots policing can be very small units of analysis, like buildings, addresses, block faces, street segments, clusters of addresses, and so on. There's significant evidence supporting the effectiveness of hotspots policing in reducing crime. In a 2012 review by Anthony Braga, who is one of the leaders in criminological research in this area, they performed a meta-analysis of 25 tests of hotspot policing strategies across 16 studies. And from this meta-analysis, the authors concluded that, and I quote, "The extant evaluation research seems to provide fairly robust evidence that hotspots policing is an effective crime prevention strategy." And hotspots policing is used by 9 out of 10 police departments in the United States. It's become widely adopted since its sort of advent in the 1980s. It's sort of become widely used. Now, predictive policing is kind of like hotspots policing on steroids or something like that. Okay, it augments hotspots policing by taking the task of prediction away from human crime analysts and giving it to a machine learning algorithm. Algorithms trained on massive data sets about the timing and location of crime can identify patterns in data, as I mentioned, that would go unnoticed by human crime analysts. And they're not susceptible to these human biases about where crime is likely to occur. So ethnographer Aaron Shapiro describes the difference between predictive policing and hotspots policing as follows. He says, predictive policing goes a step further than hotspots. Because the crime data analysis is delegated to algorithms, it can be more granular and directed. Crime data are added daily to generate predictions for each shift. Different types of crime in different places can be targeted throughout the day using various tactics. So when successful, predictive policing allows police resources to be deployed more accurately in time and place than they would be using only human crime analysts. Whereas there's significant evidence supporting the effectiveness of hotspots policing, the empirical literature on predictive policing, as far as I can tell, and I'm not a criminologist, so I'm not on the cutting edge of this stuff, is in its infancy. There's not a whole lot yet. It's a new technology, right? The LAPD began their experiments in 2011. Still, there have been some success stories. A recent predictive policing project in Atlantic City found a significant decrease in crime rates. So the project employed what's called risk terrain modeling, okay, which is a type of predictive policing algorithm. What risk terrain modeling does is it uses crime statistics about location, timing of crime, but it also looks for certain spatial vulnerabilities within the geographic area that would make them prone to future crime. So for example, abandoned buildings are hubs for drug use and drug sales and violent crime that attends those things. Dimly lit streets, dimly lit alleyways also exhibit this kind of spatial vulnerability. So it incorporates information about the geography itself to make predictions about future offending. For this project, the risk terrain modeling algorithm forecasted high-risk crime locations for each month of 2017. The crimes of interest were violent crime and property crime. So in responding to these predictions, the Atlantic City Police Department focused increased police presence on the high-risk areas. Okay, so they put more people there. But also the community contributed to altering the physical landscape in ways to make it less prone to criminal activity. So they demolished 17 abandoned buildings in these high-risk areas. They replaced dim streetlights with halogen streetlights, like little things. And according to the criminologists who wrote the report, the project was a resounding success. So even though the priority areas constituted only 1% of Atlantic City's overall land area, researchers found that targeting these areas correlated with a decline in crime in Atlantic City of 36% in 2017. 1% of land area, 36% decline in crime in 2017 compared to 2016. A separate study of New York PD's predictive policing software concluded that the predictive algorithm was more than twice as accurate as human crime analysts at predicting future crime. Okay. So there is evidence that some predictive policing algorithms are more accurate than human crime analysts.
Can I just ask?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So the hotspots thing also use this geographical information?
No. So the one thing that's distinctive of the risk terrain modeling, it's sort of like proprietary.
But it has nothing to do with the AI. Whether it's like
It is trained on crime data. So it is a machine learning algorithm.
But if whether you or not you put in the abandoned buildings, like if I'm a human.
I actually think, you know what? I'm not sure if that feature of the algorithm is trained. So I'm not sure if they in some way encoded features of the landscape into particular criminal incidents to sort of, yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that. Well, I'll get to this in a minute, but these algorithms are proprietary.
Yes.
So it's hard for me to get exactly all that information. It's a good question. So I think the effectiveness of each specific implementation of this technology will need to be tested individually, right? You can't just test risk terrain modeling and say, therefore Predpol is good at predicting future crime. But I do think this is enough to show that predictive policing appears to be effective in principle and in some instances of practice. But more empirical work needs to be done. So that's the case. That's sort of the basic case for it, for the technology's effectiveness. But nonetheless, a chorus of activists and academics have argued that predictive policing is, contrary to what I've just said, ineffective in practice. Okay. So what we can call the self-fulfilling prophecy objection to predictive policing is described in a number of places, and it calls into question the reliability of the data that is used to train predictive policing algorithms like Predpol. So the self-fulfilling prophecy objection to predictive policing is most powerful in cases where arrest data are used to train algorithms. Okay, why is that? Well, the problem with arrest data is that they can reflect much more than the incidence of crime at a particular location. Arrest data also reflect the potentially racially biased behavior of police officers on patrol, right? Arrest data reflect where those officers go, where they look hardest for crime. And so we should expect algorithms trained on that data to reflect and reinforce this biased behavior of police officers on patrol. So the problem is nicely described by Salome Barkas and Andrew Selbst. I think you have it right here. The entire set of records may fail to reflect members of protected classes in accurate proportion to others. If these arrest records capture the prejudicial or biased behavior of prior decision makers, data mining will learn from the bad example that these decisions set. It's pretty succinct. So as a result of relying on racially biased arrest data to make place-based predictions, predictive policing algorithms will send officers to patrol black communities, for example, out of proportion to the actual rate of criminal activity in those communities. Crime would therefore be more effectively prevented if those same resources were directed to places where the crime is actually occurring. Right? Therefore, this objection is supposed to show, right, predictive policing is ineffective. Okay. Now, the self-fulfilling prophecy is completed when police departments respond to these forecasts by sending more police patrols to those communities. Because greater police attention will yield more arrests in the location, which will be used to update the algorithm's forecasts, which will confirm earlier predictions. So then you send more police, get more arrests, and the cycle repeats. Now, if predictive policing is ineffective because it's racially biased in this way, it's not hard to see why it is also unfair, I think, right? I think all sides of the debate will agree that it's unfair to unequally burden minority communities with the costs of law enforcement, especially when imposing this unequal burden is ineffective at promoting the aims of policing, right?
But how
Question?
do you
Yeah.
see that it's ineffective?
So one trouble, if this self-fulfilling prophecy is right, is that what you should expect to see, I mean, so what you should expect, right, if it's effective, right, is a decline in crime, right, in the location. But the problem is that according to these algorithms, we should be allocating police resources based on how much crime is occurring. So if you have a model whereby crime is ever increasing in this location, the rationale of this model is to always send more police there, right? I'm going to say, in response to this objection, I'm going to say a bit about how we might measure crime instead that avoids this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy problem. And I think it also provides a better measure of how to assess effectiveness of an intervention. So when I first confronted this problem, it seemed decisive to me. I thought, okay, well, that's it. I'm not sure predictive policing should be used. It seems insurmountable. But I'm now less convinced by it. So the self-fulfilling prophecy objection depends on two claims, I think. One, that arrest statistics largely reflect racial bias on the part of police officers on patrol. And two, that arrests are the major input into predictive policing algorithms. But I'm not actually sure that either of those claims can be sustained. So arrest statistics for some crimes might be significantly skewed by racially biased police behavior. So for instance, nuisance crimes like loitering, vagrancy, public urination, and drug use, right? Question about whether that's a nuisance crime or not, but drug use, these are more likely to be discovered by police than reported by the community, okay? These are the sort of crimes that are found by police officers on patrol. If police are disproportionately looking around for crime in black communities, they are disproportionately likely to discover these sorts of nuisance crimes, leading to skewed arrest data for those crimes. Right? Now, however, many predictive policing algorithms do not generate forecasts for drug or nuisance crimes. So for example, the risk terrain modeling system forecasts property crimes and violent crimes, especially shootings. Predpol, at least these days, is being used to forecast vehicular theft and theft from a vehicle, so property crimes. So unlike arrest statistics for nuisance and drug crime, arrest statistics for violent and property crime are driven much less by racially biased police behavior, because statistics for these crimes are typically driven by reports generated by the community and not as a result of discoveries by police. Okay? So if there is an arrest for those crimes, it's typically because some member of the community reported it to police and then they investigated. Right? It's very rare that a police officer finds themselves right there on the site of a shooting while it's happening, right? So that's one thing. I don't think that arrest statistics for those types for non-nuisance crimes, property and violent crimes, are as clearly driven by racial bias on the part of police on patrol. Second, many predictive policing algorithms do not rely on arrest data at all to make their forecasts. So Jeffrey Brantingham, the anthropologist whose academic work was used to build the PredPol algorithm, who I understand is a controversial figure in his own department, not surprisingly. So unlike racial profiling, predictive policing targets places rather than people, right? We're not targeting black Americans for additional scrutiny in virtue of being black, right? If we're using predictive policing. Still, individuals who live in designated high-risk areas are de facto targeted with greater police attention. They're more likely to interact with police via stop, search, seizure, or arrest than people who live or work elsewhere. When high-risk areas correlate strongly with race, predictive policing can have the same outcome that people find so disturbing about racial profiling, right? Disproportionate contact with police by innocent people living in minority communities. And increased police contact in an area exposes residents of that area to a greater risk of mistaken search, seizure, arrest, or conviction, right? Being in contact with police, the thought goes, is risky. It's a risky proposition, right? These risks can lead to real harm for members of targeted communities. Restrictions of freedom of movement, threats to informational privacy, loss of autonomy, restrictions on individual expression and creativity, violations of citizens' dignity, and the perception of a lack of respect by members of the community. Now, these are all harms that have been identified a number of times by a number of scholars. These are all possible consequences of having more police on the ground in your community. And of course, there are risks of physical harm as well. These are well documented. In the extreme case, an innocent person may be killed if mistaken for an armed offender resisting arrest. And there's evidence that black Americans are already 3.5 times more likely than white Americans to be the victims of a police shooting. So the point is, when predictive policing recommends disproportionate distribution of police patrols in minority communities, it raises the probability that innocent members of those communities will have a harmful encounter with police. Okay. So even if concentrating police patrols in minority communities is effective at reducing crime, innocent residents are disproportionately burdened for the sake of promoting general security. And this is unfair. This is the concern. Now, some have suggested the unequal burdens argument is unsound when a policing practice disproportionately benefits the very people that it burdens. Okay? So concerns about unfair burdens are only really decisive if the very same practice that burdens them doesn't also benefit them to a greater extent. So writing about racial profiling, philosopher Matthias Risse and economist Richard Zeckhauser have written, "We submit that a sufficient condition for imposing unequal burdens is that those burdened more are net beneficiaries from that public good whose supply depends on their unequal burden. If the unequal imposition of a burden is counterbalanced by a net benefit that the relevant group gains, the unequal burden is not undue." Okay? It is then argued that minority communities do, in some cases, enjoy a net benefit from racial profiling. So this is an argument often made in response to arguments against racial profiling. Here's a philosopher, David Boonin. He writes, "Black Americans, after all, are disproportionately victims of crime. So when crime is reduced, black Americans, on average, are disproportionately beneficiaries." So let us call this objection the unequal benefits objection. The unequal benefits objection has some merit, okay, in the following sense. According to the FBI crime database, in 2015, of the about 13,000 homicide cases where the FBI listed a victim's racial information, 52.3% of the victims were black, despite the fact that black Americans comprise just 13.3% of the US population. Among black victims of crime, older black Americans are the most common victims of crime, and they're most commonly victimized by young black Americans. So assuming that predictive policing is effective, right, the thought is it also disproportionately benefits black communities by concentrating crime-fighting efforts in those communities, in cases where crime really is disproportionately concentrated in those areas. So David Boonin concludes, if a practice disproportionately benefits black Americans, then it's not clear why it would be unfair for it to also disproportionately burden them. Okay. Now, you might think, well, there's something amiss with this argument. I don't love it. But I hope you see that there's at least some attractive appeal. So, it's not uncommon for social programs that benefit some groups more than others to disproportionately burden the people who benefit, right? So, for example, social welfare programs impose certain burdens on people who are, say, getting unemployment benefits or food stamps. They're required to demonstrate that they're seeking work, right, in a certain way, right? There are additional burdens that come with those benefits. Crime fighting might exhibit the same kind of features. But I now want to argue that even if crime reduction benefits of predictive policing significantly outweighed the burdens for black communities, predictive policing might be unfair. Okay. It can be unfair if these benefits are disavowed. The benefits of the police practice are disavowed by the beneficiaries. Okay. So my argument begins with the defense of the general claim that it is possible for a potential victim of an intervention intended to prevent harm to them, it's possible for that victim to legitimately reject that intervention. Okay. And by rejecting that intervention, they can make that intervention morally impermissible, morally prohibited. Okay. So to begin, I don't have you have this on your handout, I believe. This is elevator 1. Check it out. So in elevator 1, we have victim taking a ride in an elevator. Aggressor begins to saw through the elevator cable because he hates victim and wishes him dead. Rescuer is walking by and is able to shoot aggressor with her sniper rifle, thereby saving victim. This is not my case. This is Jonathan Perry's. However, victim refuses intervention because he is deeply committed to nonviolence. Okay. Now, I hope you share my intuition, maybe you don't, that it would be wrong for rescuer to intervene in elevator 1, given that the beneficiary sincerely adheres to the principle of nonviolence and refuses the intervention. Now, Perry suggests that this is because, Jonathan Perry suggests that this is because individuals possess moral authority over what harms are brought against them on their behalf. So the thought is, each of us, he says, has powers of control regarding whether and for what purposes others may use our good. And just as I can exclude you from using my body or property by withholding my consent from you, I have the power to prevent you from justifying your actions by appealing to the fact that you will benefit me if I repudiate those benefits, right? If I disavow those benefits. By exercising this power, I render my good morally inadmissible to you for the purposes of justifying your action, and you commit a form of trespass against me if you attempt to do so. So Perry calls this power, the power he describes in this passage, the power of prudential exclusion. I can exclude my prudential good from justifying your actions. Now, the moral foundation of this power is a commitment to some sort of anti-paternalism, right? You see this as echoes of medical ethics, right? So it's the victim's life that's at stake, Perry says, not anybody else's. And so only he gets to decide if and how it is defended. On these matters, the individual is sovereign. So just as it's my right to decline medical treatment because of my moral or religious commitments, it is my right to decline third-party defense against aggression. Now, according to this principle, it's wrong for rescuer to intervene in elevator 1 because victim's valid refusal to consent to the intervention means that victim's well-being cannot be used to justify rescuer's harming of the aggressor. So I think single victim cases are easy enough for PPE, the principle of prudential exclusion, to handle. But what about cases where multiple victims are threatened, but only some, but not all of them refuse consent to the intervention? Right? This is more like policing, I think. So here we have elevator 2. 5 victims are taking an elevator ride. Aggressor again begins to saw through the cable. Rescuer is walking by and can shoot aggressor with her sniper rifle, saving the victims. However, while one victim consents to the intervention, the other 4 refuse consent because of their deep commitment to nonviolence. Now, if we accept Perry's description of the power of prudential exclusion, then in elevator 2 we should say that rescuer is permitted to intervene. And they're permitted to intervene because though the rescuer is precluded from appealing to the good of the 4 non-consenting victims to justify the intervention, the rescuer need not make use of their good at all to justify killing aggressor. The rescuer need only appeal to the benefits to the one consenting victim to justify killing the aggressor, right? Because that on its own is sufficient to justify the action. The thought is, think about it this way. If the other 4 people in the elevator didn't exist at all, right, rescuer would be permitted just on the grounds of the benefits to the one consenting victim to kill the aggressor. That's the thought. And so we don't need to make, so their commitment to nonviolence does not prohibit rescuer from killing aggressor in this case. So the point is securing consent from potential beneficiaries of a defensive intervention is particularly important in cases when defending some victims imposes a risk of harm on innocent bystanders. So imagine a version of elevator 2, but where there are innocent people who are at risk of being harmed by the intervention. Okay? I think this is the kind of case we have in policing. Okay? So it's very difficult to justify harming innocent people, even as an unforeseen consequence of your action. So in a case where defensive intervention imposes significant harms on innocent bystanders, and the beneficiaries of the intervention have all validly refused the intervention, it's wrong to intervene. That's the thought. In this case, there are no reasons that count in favor of the intervention, and all of the reasons not to intervene that are generated by the harms to innocent people count against it, right? So I think we can apply these lessons to predictive policing pretty straightforwardly. In predictive policing, we have a case where an aggressor threatens unjustified harm to several victims, right? The innocent community members. A rescuer, the police, has the ability to prevent threatened harm by imposing defensive harm on the aggressor or offender. Defending every victim is a condition of defending any, right? More police presence in the area, right, is going to deter, right, or protect everyone in the area. And one subset of the members of the victim group consents to that intervention, and the other subset refuses. Maybe. This is what is at issue here. Okay. The power of prudential exclusion tells us that the benefits of predictive policing for a community count morally in favor of it only when those benefits accrue to community members who have not refused consent. Only these benefits can be used to justify the unequal imposition of harms. So in a case where most of the beneficiaries of the intervention refuse consent, it becomes really hard to justify predictive policing, right? Because you can't make use of those benefits to justify the practice. So the fairness of predictive policing, I want to suggest, turns partly on what proportion of innocent members of black communities refuse consent to predictive policing, and whether this refusal is valid. Now, I cannot settle this first question. There are no surveys that I'm aware of measuring public attitudes towards predictive policing, and I've looked. Haven't found any. Maybe they're in the works. I think this absence of survey evidence is troubling, given what I've argued so far. Right? We should know this. However, I think there's indirect evidence supporting the conclusion that a significant proportion of innocent members of black communities might refuse consent to predictive policing, especially in cases where it concentrates police in their communities. An abundance of literature supports the conclusion that black Americans have far less favorable attitudes toward police than do white Americans. Only 40% of black Americans have favorable attitudes towards police. 11% have very unfavorable attitudes. 56% of black Americans say that police tactics are too harsh. And a recent Pew survey showed a much greater percentage of black Americans than white Americans think criminal risk scoring algorithms for people on parole are unfair. So black Americans think that those algorithms are unfair at a much higher rate than white Americans do. If this perception of unfairness generalizes to other algorithmic decision-making processes, then black Americans might very well be highly suspicious of those. Now, let's assume there is refusal to consent on the part of members of black communities, right? Is this refusal to consent valid, right? It's not just, I can't just refuse consent to an intervention for any reason, right? I can't refuse consent to an intervention because I'm kind of tired. I don't want to be bothered, right? It can't be a trivial reason. So it might seem that refusal to consent cannot be valid once we grant that predictive policing is more effective at apprehending and deterring offenders than alternative measures, right? So we're going to say, look, it's rational. How could a member of a black community have a valid reason not to consent? Well, I think this would be too quick. I think refusal to consent can be valid if the beneficiary of the intervention has good reason to believe that the defensive intervention that benefits them will impose significant moral costs, okay, on themselves or on others, and that those costs are morally weightier than the benefits, okay, given this person's best evidence, and where reasonable people might disagree about whether the benefits outweigh the costs. So I gave you a big list of the costs of defensive intervention by police, right? I think those are significant. And I think reasonable people could disagree about whether those costs morally outweigh the benefits in crime reduction that black communities receive from predictive policing. And the point is, even if they're incorrect about how the weighting works, it would be reasonable for someone to think that the costs outweigh the benefits. I think that I want to suggest that members of black communities do have anecdotal, historical, media-based, and empirical evidence that suggests that concentration of police patrols will impose significant costs on their communities. So studies show racial disparities in police use of force, drug enforcement, traffic ticketing. 39% of black Americans know someone who has been mistreated by police physically. That's twice the rate of white Americans. Okay. Moreover, the role that law enforcement has played in upholding institutions which black Americans were the primary victims of, including slavery, segregation, and Jim Crow. I think given this, it's reasonable for black Americans to see present disparities as reflecting a continued discounting of their interests by criminal justice institutions. That's not unreasonable for someone to think. And I think this establishes a strong prima facie case that refusal to consent is valid on the part of members of black communities. It's valid given their evidence. So the upshot of this journey into the ethics of third-party defense is that it is not enough to respond to the challenge of unfairness against predictive policing to show that the benefits of crime reduction outweigh the costs of the intervention for those communities that it unequally burdens. It must also be shown that enough of the beneficiaries can be understood as not validly refusing consent to predictive policing. Police attention must, in some sense, be welcome in order to be fair. So where do we go from here? So just wrapping up quickly, I want to suggest that there are two steps police departments might take to address the concerns that I've raised here. The first is that one thing police can do is make a case, a convincing case, to members of targeted communities that predictive policing targets serious offenses like property crime and violent crime, and not nuisance crimes or drug offenses. There's a strong relationship between police targeting serious crimes in a community and favorable attitudes toward police in those communities, perhaps unsurprisingly, right? Some police departments have taken steps in this direction. I think the biggest obstacle to securing community consent for predictive policing is that predictive policing algorithms are protected by intellectual property. So there's, in some sense, only so much that police departments are legally able to reveal about the decision-making processes responsible for the allocation of police patrols. So if these protections preclude police departments from disclosing these decision procedures, then I worry that communities will continue to be suspicious of the technology, even if it is effective, unbiased, and targeting serious offenses. A final way to address this is you can reduce the costs to innocent members of targeted communities, right? So if you can reduce risk of harm to innocents, you might be able to circumvent these concerns about consent. And one way to do this is to adopt problem-oriented policing tactics, which I just discussed, which is where when you can, it's much better to do non-enforcement intervention and target places rather than people, right? So rather than putting more police on the ground, tear down abandoned buildings, improve lighting in areas, make changes to the physical environment rather than putting more boots and guns on the ground. And I think if these are just a couple of steps that departments might take.
Let's open it up to questions, and I will pass the microphone around. Okay.
I think you touched on this towards the end, but it seemed to me that a critical link in your argument was the notion that if you put extra cops in an area in order to prevent car break-ins or thefts and homicides, that would inevitably lead to the increase in stops, searches, and seizures of drugs and things like that. And I don't know that that may be in fact the case.
Right.
And then the moral logic that you pose is, well, if you do that, you might prevent one homicide for every 10 additional drug convictions that come out of that.
Right.
And that might be an unsustainable or unwelcome intervention. But it seems like that's a matter of policing practice, that you could stop that particular policing practice. And I just think of my time in Chicago, which, by the way, just elected an African-American cop as their mayor. Mm-hmm. And I think if the Chicagoans were told that she was going to redistribute police resources out of the hotspots of homicide in Chicago and put them in white neighborhoods because she considered it too racist to overly patrol homicide hotspots,
Right.
that would be seen as racially insensitive as much as anything else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. So, right. So, I think it would be. I think a significant part of the debate about predictive policing ends up turning on the sorts of crime that we're targeting using these algorithms, right? My sort of suggestion is that, look, if what members of targeted communities know is that a bunch more police are being put on the ground in their neighborhood, that may not be enough for them to know how to feel about it, right? That's not enough evidence, right? If they know that these police are gonna engage in like a stop and frisk policy, right, like they did in New York for a long time, well, this would be unwelcome additional presence. But if a clear case can be made that, look, no, we're targeting homicides and we're doing it this way. We're not deploying people on the basis of like drug arrests, right, and so on. We're targeting reported homicides. Then I think you could make that intervention welcome by members of the community. In fact, the criminological data on this is sort of interesting because Black Americans demonstrate a disproportionate fear of crime, fear of serious crime, and a simultaneous disproportionate distrust of police. And so there is this kind of paradoxical situation where high-risk areas want more police intervention. They just don't want the kind of police intervention that they feel like they get. So I do think that transparency is really important for that reason. I hope that kind of addresses your point. Yeah.
Really a fascinating talk and arguments. I keep thinking of a study that I think Papa Christos was the lead author of, that tracked the effect of a police shooting that was not the subject of any punitive action with respect to the police officer. And I think it was St. Louis or, somewhere out west there. And that area, maybe a bit further, maybe Oklahoma. But there was a case of a police shooting of a black resident that was initially kind of papered over and wasn't a big deal, but then it really exploded in the media when some things came out. And I believe it was Papa Christos, but in any case, the researchers tracked the impact of that event and the publicity around it on calls to police. And they absolutely plummeted in the black community. People just did not trust what the police were about at that point, were totally turned off. And the issue seemed to me to have nothing to do with whatever the policing strategy was, problem-oriented or who knows, and B, nothing really to do with individual benefit and a cost-benefit calculation. It had to do with people trying to defend their community and having this sense that, my God, this is going to destroy us, this kind of license,
Yeah.
on the part of people who are carrying, weapons, who
Yeah.
should be defending us
Yeah.
in our community. And it just seems to me that taking into account, the issue of just trust as being so basic, and into account the issue of a community-based orientation
Yeah.
to evaluating cost and benefit, rather than, am I going to be less likely to get, knifed in the back or something?
Yeah. Yeah.
Walking down the street.
Yeah.
Just kind of, really changes the equation.
Yeah.
And but seems to me to be dealing with the real fundamentals of the challenges of policing that is not community responsive.
Yeah. I wholly agree with everything you said. I mean, I think. I mean, I don't think there was a... If anything, I mean, I think, one thing I could do in this sort of talk is give more, make clearer how important these sort of personal experiences are on people's attitudes towards crime fighting and their trust in police. I mean, because, I gave you some statistics, right? 40% of black Americans know someone who's been physically mistreated by police, compared with about 20% of white Americans. But those statistics include stories like this that have these sort of ramifications throughout an entire community, right? And it's, what's that?
Sandra Bland.
Yeah, right, right, yeah.
Stop for not signaling and dies with
Yeah, 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 exactly, right. And I certainly didn't mean to suggest that there is this kind of like self-interested cost-benefit analysis going on, but rather, from the standpoint of a member of a targeted community, they're thinking about all of the people they know who might be the victim of that type of police action, right? When they're thinking about, do I want to call the cops right now? And that's exactly the kind of person I'm thinking of when I talk about sort of the moral authority that people have to refuse intervention. There's one small note about that. There's this interesting relationship between, I mentioned that crime incidents in certain communities might actually be underestimated by crime reports because people tend not to report crime in black and Hispanic communities. But the reasons they tend not to report crime are precisely the reasons they have to refuse intervention in the first place. So the reasons that it makes sense to put more police on the ground from the perspective of pure enforcement, right? Those generate the very problems that cause those people to withhold consent from the intervention. So
because of the kind of police.
yeah, yes, yeah, exactly. Because of the kind of police action that happens when there are more police on the ground. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just talk? Okay,
Yeah, there's no,
talking.
There's no speaker.
So I just have I think I missed something in your argument or misunderstood something in your argument.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take the elevator 2 example.
Yeah.
I thought the upshot of that was that the consent of one of the victims was enough to allow the shooting. Doesn't that then imply that if 1 out of 5, so 20%
Yeah.
of the African American community said, we're into
Let's
this
do it.
policing,
Yeah.
then that,
Is enough.
according to your argument, would be enough. Is that an implication of your argument?
So the bit that I need a third case. This is a philosopher's solution. So I think I need a third case. So the problem, the reason that case is not perfectly analogous to the situation of targeted communities is that in that case there are no innocent bystanders that are presented with a risk of being harmed.
Right.
And so if you,
Right.
this is why I need a third case. A version of the elevator case where there is a significant risk to innocent bystanders, it becomes an open question whether the consent of the one is sufficient to justify the intervention.
Yeah.
And that's what you have in the case of predictive policing.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Yes,
thanks.
mine sort of follows this because I just thought that it was actually really weird that you said that the elevator case maps nicely onto, because the whole second part of the talk is about how the rescuer is the aggressor, right? So like that, and that the problem is that
Right.
that is very, and that's also your point, is that is so muddled
Yeah.
that it's precisely not at all the elevator case, none of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because the risk it's not a worry of harming others, right? That like it's not like I'm committed to nonviolence. It's that, listen, if you rescue me, you might kill me, right? And in terms of like whether this is a rational concern, it's highly rational, right? It's extremely rational, yeah. So I just felt that it was surprising
Right.
that you said that it mapped neatly onto.
Yeah, I mean, right. So I guess you're suggesting like a better version of the case is like for each of these victims,
You might
save their life or you might blow their
be
head off.
shot. Yeah, exactly. And then it instantly becomes rational to not give consent. Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So that's right. So what is missing is this kind of, yeah. There's a lot more to discuss there. Actually, that's really helpful.
So you can move from utilitarianism to game theory.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's a lot to say about that, but I might have to think more about what exactly I want to say. I think there are still lessons to draw from the ethics of third-party defense, but the analogy is a lot less clean than I make it out to be.
Well, it's just ironic with that you use the rescuer when precisely you're saying that the rescuer easily becomes the aggressor.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the interesting difference there is that sort of the epistemic position of the beneficiaries, right? They don't, from the perspective of innocent members of a black community, they don't know whether they or their loved ones are going to benefit from the intervention or be the victims. And that's something that's totally missing from the elevator cases.
And they don't know whether the aggressor is the savior or the savior
Yeah,
is the aggressor.
yeah. No, that's important. That should be made a lot clearer.
To some extent, the missing link is the connection with the trust factor.
Yeah.
Because often, at least in practical politics, if the trust is there between the community and the authorities, and the authorities operate on an implied consent or lack of rejection model in public policy terms.
Right.
And it's only when the trust is completely missing that this kind of thinking comes into.
Yeah,
So-
that's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
at the risk of sort of moving away from your core argument, but maybe a little bit towards the AI and experience agenda.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think the technology of predictive policing is actually the critical or a critical issue here? Is it simply a tool which has made it easier to do this kind of thing and therefore surfaced a bunch of issues that were otherwise not so well understood?
Yeah.
Or is it a key component to some major social change?
Yeah.
Cops were doing this for a long time.
Yeah, and one could argue.
Yeah, something like it. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing is that the hubbub surrounding predictive policing, I think, has brought to light issues related to how we distribute police in communities, right? Decisions about how to distribute police in communities. It's brought those issues to light in a way that they haven't sort of been emphasized before. I mean, people have talked about, for, many years, police abuse of minorities, right? But the issue of allocation and sort of fairness in allocation, I think that's really only recently gotten a lot of attention publicly and by academics because of predictive policing. So it's useful in bringing to light the issue. Is there anything special about predictive policing? I think the one thing that is special about predictive policing is the are two things. It's the intellectual property restrictions that apply to it.
So there's a transparency concern.
And yes, exactly. And the intelligibility of the algorithm itself. So I think that when it gets down to it, and I didn't get to spend much time on these issues, I think it might pose distinct obstacles to generating trust or establishing trust, because it's a black box, right? To use the buzzword, right? And not only is it a black box, but it's a legally protected black box, which is highly suspicious if you're someone who's being targeted, right, by the program. And yeah, so go ahead.
Well,
Please.
I mean, there are ways to fix that, right? So we could, as a society,
Working on
say that, you know, if you're going to use it, you have to disclose it,
Yeah.
what the internals are. Or you could say, we're going to make a change in the current practice of the patent office and say that these kinds of algorithms are in fact patentable and
Yeah.
therefore disclosable with economic protection for the inventor.
Right. Yeah. No. And I think it does actually. So I'm not suggesting that they're insurmountable obstacles, but I do think it gets to the heart of our social institutions concerning intellectual property rights and sort of what our conventions are, what our legal protections are supposed to be for those things, because we might have to
Renegotiate those, yeah.
revise
Yeah.
those significantly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I was just noticing that in your elevator examples, we drew a distinction between valid and invalid reasons for
Yeah.
non-consent.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if you can say more about that, because it seems like the person determining what is going to be a valid and invalid reason for non-consent is going to be the person in power, which may not be in this community.
Oh, yeah. Good. Well, one thing I want to say is whatever the valid reasons for withholding consent are, they're not determined by the attitudes of someone in power. They're independent of whatever, whoever that individual might be. So, you know, I don't know, simply because the chief of police says, well, that's not a good reason not to consent, doesn't make it a bad reason, morally speaking.
Right.
But as far as giving you like an account of what reasons are valid and what aren't, I don't have an account.
Yeah.
I'm sort of reporting my own intuitions about this stuff. And so I think that, I mean, at the very least, in order to have a valid reason not to consent, you have to be mentally competent. You have to be in your right mind. You have to be thinking clearly. But obviously that's not enough, right? I think that the clearest case to me are sincerely held moral commitments. And the sort of sincerely held moral commitments that apply in this case are sort of concerns about protecting one's family and other close relations, right? So like, if I feel like I have a special obligation to my family members and the people in my community, and I feel like there are significant moral costs that will be imposed on them by this intervention aimed at protecting me, right? That can be a valid reason for me to withhold consent from the intervention. I'm just reporting my intuition about that, though.
Yeah.
I don't have like a uniform account, you know. But whereas like, you know, a bad reason would be like, well, I really wanted to get ice cream today,
Right.
and this intervention is going to like make me change my plans.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious to see
trivial.
where that kind of narrows down into a
Like a
less clear case.
Oh,
You know.
right. Like
You know,
a
it's
fuzzy-
clear if someone's going to die.
Mhm.
That's a very clear case where we'd want to intuitively say
Yeah.
that is a valid reason. Ice cream is an invalid reason
Yeah.
intuitively, but I wonder where the convergence of those notions is.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I think empirical concerns might bear on that too, right? So if there's an ongoing dispute about the effectiveness of predictive policing, and I object to predictive policing because based on my evidence, I have good evidence that it's ineffective, that could be I think a legitimate reason to withhold consent. But maybe a fuzzier one. I don't know. Yeah, that's helpful. I'll think more about that. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. That was a really, really interesting
thank you.
presentation. And I'm probably the only non-philosopher in the room. So my question is of a different order
Yeah, no.
than all the ones that you've been asked.
Welcome.
So, I mean, you mentioned that the LAPD has been using predictive policing for a while.
Yeah.
Has there been any study about how the use of predictive policing has affected the ways in which the police officers themselves see their engagement with the community? And maybe this isn't not an exact analogy, but I'm thinking about, people who operate drones. What is their relationship to those who are being targeted by the drone? So, because having that kind of technology at your disposal, does that make you more reflective about the ways in which you need to become more morally complex, or does it free you from having to have those self-reflective engagements with the ethics of what you're doing? So.
I think it's a very interesting question. I'm not aware of any such studies. I have read, the most I've seen, there are some studies on the effects of PredPol on arrest rates and crime rates and stuff. I don't know any studies about attitudes. There are newspaper articles that say that police officers were highly resentful of the technology when it was first implemented. Because in the original experiments, officers were required to spend, I think, at least 45 minutes in several of the boxes every day. And police officers resented that, just because they don't like being told what to do. And also, I think they thought they didn't know why they were going there. Right? They just knew the program told them, and they thought, well, I'm as good a judge as this program about like where the hot spots are on my beat. So this thing is,
Phenomenology.
There we go. We got there.
But is it true that we absolutely don't have any insight into the algorithms being used, because it's proprietary software?
Yeah.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. Yeah. So that's true of predictive policing software. It's also true of the Compass algorithm that's used to determine risk scores for parole, for people on parole. And there's an ongoing, an emerging conversation about whether this violates certain constitutionally protected rights or moral rights that we have to an explanation or to understand.
Duncan, can I offer two analogies that might clarify some of what's at issue in the dynamics of trust?
Yeah.
So one, which actually I think is a pretty closely tracking analogy, is the dynamic of counterinsurgency operations in war. In counterinsurgency operations in war, when they're being done well, the first aim is to establish trust with the population. And there's a clear sense that the use of technology, and by the way, some of the technologies that are being adopted by policing were first developed in counterinsurgency context, including some of the sort of predictive technology. But the sense was that the technology could never be an instrument for the generation of trust, but it had to be the other way around, that trust had to be generated by some kind of on-the-ground benefit, change your life to the better, have an advantage over the Taliban or what have you, whatever you're talking about in a specific context. And then once it was established, you introduce the technology and maybe you generate a virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
In this context, seems like there might be a question of getting the direction backwards. And that's one possible analogy. The other analogy...
Can you say the sense in which it's getting the direction backwards?
That here there seems to be a confusion about whether predictive policing might be an instrument for creating the trust in the first place. At least that's part of what I understood.
Right.
And then another analogy completely from a different context has to do with hiring and the use of algorithms in hiring. So large chain store, large fast food restaurant hiring is these days often algorithmic.
Yeah.
right? So a job at McDonald's or Dunkin' Donuts, the decision whether to hire you would often be algorithmic. And on the other hand, when you get hired by the University of Florida, that's not an algorithmic process, or any sort of white shoe, white collar, what have you, right?
Right.
And I wonder, for example, if there's anything to learn from that to, is the patrolling, sending of police forces to upper middle class neighborhoods as algorithmic as it is to, other neighborhoods.
Yeah, right.
Right? So part of what makes one feel good about a white collar, white shoe job is the sort of personalized, thoughtful, human, and probably deeply flawed decision-making process, right? But you feel that you're being taken seriously, whereas that's not the case with algorithmic decision-making. So
interesting.
I wonder if there's an analogy to be made there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it seems like there are a couple of issues that come up there. I mean, one is, we might ask, well, why don't we allocate the job of making white-collar hiring decisions to, why don't we outsource that to algorithms? You might say, well,
the people who get those jobs push back against
well, that's one answer, right? Or maybe we think the decision-making is too nuanced or fine-grained to be, you can't just look at a person's educational history.
At least that's what we like to tell ourselves.
Right.
White collars.
Right. And so one, I guess one interesting question is like whether decisions about where or how to allocate police are more like white-collar job decisions or more like blue-collar job decisions. Another interesting question is whether, this decision to allocate our decision-making about certain types of crime expresses a kind of, I don't know if this is what you were saying, but it expresses a kind of attitude about people who disproportionately commit those crimes. Right. Whereas we would never do something like that for white-collar crime.
Right.
Right. We would never.
Even though there's an argument that they're.
Does do that for tax fraud.
Right. Yeah. So maybe it's not a perfect analogy. Yeah, that's helpful though. Thanks.
Any last questions? Please. Famous last words.
Wouldn't the people or person who makes the algorithm be biased?
They might be, yeah. And
what about the ProPublica case in Florida?
yeah, so right, so that case has become less clear cut.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but it's a strange thing, fairness in machine learning, because some measures of fairness are incompatible with others, and they will often give conflicting results, and they both seem reasonable. So that's part of what's going on in the ProPublica case. But yeah, so how does the bias of the designer infect the algorithm? It can do that in various ways, right? So one way is what we were just talking about, sort of the choice of statistics to use when training up the algorithm, right? So if a programmer is, I don't know, I guess, I'm not sure what sort of bias you're imagining, but.
Just any.
Yeah, but if they're biased against, I don't know, maybe drug crime or something like that, right? Then they're going to focus on a certain type of statistic and train the algorithm, right, on that data. And that'll affect the kinds of patterns the algorithm identifies and the kind of predictions that it makes. So it can certainly affect the algorithm in all sorts of various ways. I guess the hope is, the dream, and I've heard some people talk about this, is that we find a way to audit these algorithms, kind of algorithmic audit. Now, I am not technically able to do that, right? But that's the idea, that you could actually, you can test the algorithm for bias, and people have proposed different ways for doing that. And they very quickly become too mathematically complex for me to sort of understand. But it has to do with sort of figuring out the relative error rate of the algorithm for different populations, right? So the hope is we can identify those biases later on in the process. But,
I think with that we ran out of time. So thank you
all
very
right.
much.
Thanks. Thanks for staying all the way through.